They whispered at first among battalions, in officers' messes and guarded letters home. Long before the bombs fell on Dresden, long before the pistol echoed in the Berlin bunker, Germany's finest generals already knew, the war could not be won. The realization did not come as a single blow, but as a slow corrosion. Confidence dissolved into unease, unease into doubt, and doubt into grim certainty. The men who had once felt invincible began to sense the abyss behind their triumphs. That in the early summer of 1941, the Wehrmacht stood at its peak. Within 2 years, Hitler's armies had crushed Poland, stormed through Norway and France, subdued the Low Countries, and overrun the Balkans. Generals who had endured humiliation after 1918 now basked in vindication. Their theories, speed, precision, and shock, had rewritten modern warfare. The world trembled before them. When the invasion of the Soviet Union began, they believed they were witnessing destiny itself. Columns of panzers roared across endless plains. Field Marshal Fedor von Bock's Army Group Center advanced hundreds of kilometers in weeks. Soviet armies collapsed in encirclements that swallowed hundreds of thousands. Maps in Berlin blazed with red arrows surging eastward. To many officers, the victory seemed inevitable. Hitler's prophecy, that Bolshevism would collapse in a single campaign, felt close to fulfillment, yet beneath the euphoria ran a quiet unease. Some of the older officers, men who had fought at Verdun and the Somme, recognized the pattern too well. The front was too vast. The supply lines too fragile. Heinz Guderian's armored spearheads outran their convoys. Fuel ran dry. Trucks sank into the mud. Infantry trudged behind, days late to the front. But still, Berlin demanded more, advance deeper, faster, farther into the Soviet heartland. By November, the snow came. The temperature plunged, weapons froze, oil congealed in engines, and the myth of German invincibility began to fracture. Outside Moscow, the Red Army counterattacked with fresh divisions from Siberia. The Wehrmacht, exhausted, starving, unprepared for the cold, reeled backward. The quick war had vanished. What remained was survival. In frostbitten dugouts, officers stared into the dark, listening to the wind howl across the steppe. They saw their men dying not from bullets, but from hunger and exposure. They understood that this was not the blitzkrieg they had mastered, but a war of endurance against a foe that would not break. The first fatal doubts took root there, in the frozen forests of Russia, beneath a pale and merciless sky. Orders from Berlin no longer inspired confidence, they inspired dread. The generals knew what Hitler did not, that the enemy's strength was growing, not fading. And though they continued to fight, to obey, to lead, they did so with a hollow certainty. The war they had unleashed was already consuming them. Germany was no longer racing toward victory, it was marching, slowly and blindly, toward defeat. The silence that followed each failed offensive carried more weight than the victories that had preceded them. What had begun as a campaign of conquest was turning into a slow unraveling. And in that silence, among maps and casualty reports, a truth began to whisper in every mind that dared to listen: the war was lost, though none yet dared to speak it aloud. Spring 1942. The snow melted into rivers of mud that swallowed convoys whole. The front had not moved. The victory that Hitler promised was nowhere in sight. Yet orders came again, renewed offensives, renewed hope, renewed lies. The generals obeyed, but their confidence had hollowed into habit. What they once called destiny now felt like obligation. Hitler demanded momentum. He wanted oil, steel, and glory. He ordered the Wehrmacht south, toward the Caucasus, toward the Volga. Operation Blue, he called it. The generals called it reckless. The army was exhausted, the supply lines stretched beyond repair, yet the Führer saw only maps and arrows. He divided his forces, sending one toward Stalingrad, the other toward the oil fields. It was a fatal decision, Field Marshal von Bock protested. He warned that splitting the armies would mean disaster. Hitler dismissed him with contempt. "You always see black clouds," he said, and stripped him of command. In silence, other officers watched. They understood the risk. But in Hitler's Germany, doubt was treason. Through the heat of summer, the panzers advanced once more. Dust-choked engines, tires burst, fuel ran thin. The distances were endless, the Russians relentless. Each mile gained cost lives that could not be replaced. The enemy no longer broke in panic, they adapted, they countered, they learned. Still, Berlin demanded progress. By autumn, the German Sixth Army reached Stalingrad. The city was a wasteland of rubble and smoke. The Soviets refused to surrender. Every street, every factory became a fortress. The Luftwaffe turned the city to ashes, yet still the Red Army held. Reports from the front grew darker, ammunition short, food gone, casualties beyond count. Yet Hitler promised resupply, promised victory. The generals at headquarters already knew what the front commanders did not dare to admit. Stalingrad was a trap. In November, the trap closed. Soviet armies struck from north and south, cutting through the flanks manned by Romania and Italy. The encirclement was swift and total. For the first time in the war, a German field army was surrounded, hundreds of thousands trapped in a frozen circle of death. Inside, General Paulus pleaded for permission to break out. Hitler refused. The Sixth Army will stand fast, he declared. Capitulation is dishonor. The generals listening by radio knew what that meant. They knew the army was doomed. Supplies dwindled, frostbite spread, starvation followed. Still, the order remained, hold Stalingrad at all costs. And so they held, until there was nothing left to hold. In February 1943, silence returned to the radios. The Sixth Army was gone. 90,000 survivors marched into captivity. Stalingrad had fallen, and with it, the illusion of invincibility. The news swept through every headquarters, every officer's tent, every bunker. The myth of German superiority had shattered. For the first time, they saw defeat in its true form, not a setback, not a tactical error, but the breaking of an empire's will. In private, some generals whispered what could not be said in public: the war is lost. Others clung to faith in new offensives, new plans, new miracles. But deep inside, they all felt the same hollow truth: Stalingrad had not merely destroyed an army. It had destroyed belief. The spring of 1943 brought only the illusion of recovery. Germany prepared for one more grand offensive, Operation Citadel, the attack at Kursk. It was meant to restore pride, to erase Stalingrad's shame. Maps were redrawn, speeches rehearsed, faith forced back into weary hearts. But behind every confident order lay the same unspoken truth. The Wehrmacht was no longer the master of war. It was chasing ghosts of victories past. Many generals doubted the plan. Intelligence warned that the Soviets were waiting, that their defenses were layered deep: trenches, mines, anti-tank guns, reserves stacked in the thousands. The element of surprise was gone. Yet Hitler insisted. "We must strike before the enemy grows stronger," he said. And so the generals obeyed, not out of belief, but out of duty. They were soldiers of a system where obedience was survival. In July, the thunder began. Thousands of tanks rolled forward across fields bristling with Soviet guns. The greatest armored battle in history unfolded, metal against metal, smoke thick as fog, the ground trembling under the weight of destruction. Within days, it was clear, the attack had failed. The Soviets held firm, their reserves unbroken, their counterattacks ferocious. German armor burned on the steppes, and with it, the last hope of turning the tide. When the order came to withdraw, silence filled the headquarters. Kursk had been the last great gamble. Its failure sealed the outcome of the war. From that moment, the Wehrmacht fought a retreating war. They would never regain the initiative. The generals knew it. They saw it on the maps: front lines bending backward, territory shrinking, losses mounting. Yet Hitler raged, refusing to see what they saw. He demanded counterattacks where there were no men left to fight, victories where only ashes remained. He spoke of miracle weapons, of secret technologies that would reverse the tide. The officers listening no longer believed. They nodded, saluted, and left the room knowing his words were delusion. By late 1943, the change was complete. The arrogance of 1940 had turned to fatalism. German industry could not keep pace with its losses. Allied bombers roamed unchallenged over the Reich. The U-boat fleet was broken in the Atlantic. On the Eastern Front, the Red Army pressed westward with relentless strength. And yet, orders from Berlin still spoke of final victory. In mess halls and field tents, generals spoke in quiet tones. Not of triumph, but of endurance. Some dreamed of saving what could be saved, Germany itself, perhaps, if not the regime. A few dared to imagine removing Hitler altogether. The idea was no longer unthinkable. Men like Ludwig Beck, Henning von Tresckow, and Klaus von Stauffenberg began to move from talk to conviction. They were not idealists seeking glory, they were soldiers who saw the abyss ahead and sought to halt it, but to speak such words was death. The Gestapo listened, the walls had ears, and even the faintest whisper of dissent could end in a firing squad. So most remained silent, pretending loyalty while inwardly mourning the Germany they thought they served. They had once fought for a future. Now they fought only to delay the end. Kursk had proven what many already suspected, the war was unwinnable. But worse still, it had proven that their leader would never accept it. And so the generals found themselves trapped, not only by the enemy at their borders, but by the man in their own command. Obedience had become the enemy of survival. The war's outcome was no longer uncertain, it was inevitable. Yet Hitler demanded loyalty, demanded sacrifice, demanded faith in a victory that no longer existed. The generals, bound by oath and fear, obeyed. But in their eyes, the fire had gone out. Duty had replaced conviction. Silence had replaced belief. On June 6, Allied troops stormed the beaches of Normandy. The Western Front, once a distant threat, had become a brutal reality. German defenses shattered under the weight of air power and artillery. Within days, it was clear that France could not be held. Yet Hitler refused withdrawal. He forbade retreat, forbade logic, forbade truth itself. From his map room in the Wolf's Lair, he moved imaginary divisions across a board already lost to reality. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commander of Army Group B, toured the collapsing front. He saw what the Führer would not. Germany's forces were broken, outnumbered, outgunned, and exhausted. He spoke quietly to his staff, the enemy's material superiority is overwhelming. Every day we prolong this war is a crime. Rommel urged Hitler to negotiate peace with the Western Allies. The reply was rage. Hitler accused him of defeatism, of cowardice. The gulf between soldier and leader had become absolute. At headquarters across Europe, other officers reached the same conclusion. The war could not be saved, only ended. The whispers of resistance that began after Stalingrad now hardened into resolve. In Berlin, a conspiracy took shape. Men like Stauffenberg, Beck, and Tresckow, once loyal servants of the regime, now plotted its destruction. To them, assassination was no longer treason, but salvation. The Reich could only survive if its master died. On July 20, 1944, Stauffenberg placed the bomb beneath the conference table in Hitler's East Prussian headquarters. The explosion tore through the room, killing 4 men, but not Hitler. The Führer survived, bruised and enraged. Within hours, the Gestapo unleashed terror across Germany. The dream of redemption died before it began. Rommel, though uninvolved in the plot, fell under suspicion. Summoned to Berlin, he was offered a choice, public trial and disgrace, or suicide with honor. On October 14, he took poison in his car. His name was buried with silence, his heroism rewritten as betrayal. Other generals met the same fate. Gunther von Kluge, accused of sympathy with the plotters, swallowed cyanide on his way to Berlin. Hundreds were executed, hanged with piano wire in the dungeons of Plötzensee. The officer corps that had once embodied discipline and unity was being consumed by its own despair. After the failure of the July plot, any remaining illusions of salvation vanished. Those who survived learned one lesson: Hitler would destroy everything before he surrendered. And yet, still they fought. Some out of fear. Some out of habit. Some out of loyalty to the men under their command. But inside, they knew, the end could no longer be delayed. In the ruins of Normandy, in the forests of the Ardennes, in the villages of Poland, the same thought haunted every commander: it was over. Germany was bleeding to death, and no miracle weapon could stop it. Yet to speak those words aloud was still forbidden. The generals had become prisoners of their own obedience, forced to carry out a war they no longer believed in, for a leader they no longer trusted, in the name of a victory they knew could never come. By the close of 1944, Germany stood surrounded, its skies lost, its armies shattered, its allies gone. But Hitler still promised victory. The generals no longer listened. Winter, 1944. The Reich was collapsing. The Red Army had crossed into East Prussia, and the Western Allies were deep in France. Yet Hitler ordered one final gamble: the Ardennes offensive. It was to be his last grand illusion, a desperate thrust meant to split the Allied front and force negotiation. His generals knew the truth. They lacked fuel, men, and time. But still, they obeyed. On December 16, German guns roared across the mist-covered forests of Belgium. At first, chaos gripped the Allied lines, towns like Bastogne and Saint-Vith caught in the storm. But within days, resistance stiffened. American troops, entrenched in the snow and ice, refused to yield. The offensive stalled. The fuel ran out. Tanks froze on empty roads. By January, it was over. What Hitler had called his final strike had become a graveyard of steel. In his underground bunker, reports arrived daily, all carrying the same message: defeat. Hitler dismissed them, shouting that his armies were still victorious. His generals stood in silence. Many had stopped arguing. To reason with him was pointless. The man who once commanded Europe now ruled only maps and delusions. Reality no longer reached him. Field commanders, far from Berlin, made their own grim decisions. Some surrendered entire divisions without orders, choosing to save lives rather than prolong the slaughter. Others fought on, knowing each engagement was meaningless. The Wehrmacht, once a machine of precision, had become fragments, isolated, starving, leaderless. Soldiers marched not toward victory, but toward captivity or death. In East Prussia, civilians fled westward, endless columns of wagons, mothers clutching children, soldiers too young to shave guiding them through snow and fire. Behind them, the Red Army advanced relentlessly, exacting vengeance for years of destruction. Villages burned. The roads were littered with the dead. The generals who saw it knew, this was the end of Germany as they had known it. By February 1945, even the most loyal officers had stopped believing in survival. Albert Kesselring, Heinz Guderian, and others pleaded for realistic withdrawals, for a defensive line that could save the heart of the country. Hitler refused. "We will fight to the last man," he declared. But those words, once symbols of defiance, now sounded like madness. Every order from Berlin sent more men to die for a fantasy. In private, despair spread through the officer corps. Some turned to alcohol, others to silence. A few ended their lives. General Model shot himself rather than surrender. General Schorner abandoned his post and fled. The myth of German invincibility had crumbled. Discipline held only because there was nothing left to replace it. Meanwhile, Allied bombers turned German cities into ash. Dresden, once a jewel of Europe, vanished in fire. Columns of smoke rose for miles, visible even from the front lines. In the west, Cologne, Hamburg, and Berlin lay in ruins. The men who had once sworn loyalty to a 1,000-year Reich now watched it die before their eyes. Still, Hitler spoke of counterattacks, of secret divisions, of armies that no longer existed. His generals stood in silence, their faces expressionless, their thoughts elsewhere, on their families, their soldiers, their country in flames. The oath that had once bound them now felt like a curse. By March 1945, American forces had crossed the Rhine. The Soviets were closing on Berlin. The generals knew the truth. It was no longer about winning, only about surviving long enough to witness the inevitable end. They had lost the war long ago. Now, they were only watching its final act unfold. April 1945. Berlin was dying. The city that once symbolized Hitler's power had become his tomb. The thunder of artillery echoed day and night as the Red Army closed in from every direction. The streets were filled with rubble, the air thick with smoke and dust. Civilians hid in basements, children carried rifles too heavy for their hands, and soldiers without hope guarded streets already lost. In the Führerbunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, Hitler clung to maps that no longer mattered. He spoke of phantom divisions, of counterattacks led by armies that no longer existed. His generals stood motionless, their faces drained of expression. They no longer argued. They no longer believed. The war had passed beyond reason, beyond command. General Hans Krebs brought reports from the front. The Soviets were only blocks away. Hitler listened, then demanded imaginary reinforcements. Every man in that bunker knew the truth: it was over. Yet none dared say it. The oath still bound them, even as the empire they served turned to ash above their heads. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel and Alfred Jodl, once powerful figures of the Wehrmacht, now signed meaningless orders to divisions that were gone. The lines of command had collapsed. Communication failed. Germany no longer had an army, only scattered fragments fighting to delay the inevitable. Outside Berlin, General Walther Wenck's 12th Army was ordered to relieve the capital. Wenck knew the order was impossible. His men were exhausted, outnumbered, and surrounded. Still, he obeyed, not for Hitler, but to open a corridor for civilians fleeing west. He saved thousands, knowing it would not change the outcome. Inside the bunker, despair consumed the last circle of power. Goebbels preached loyalty as his children played in the hallway above their graves. Himmler attempted secret peace negotiations, betraying the master he once worshipped. Hitler, upon hearing it, erupted in fury, calling him a traitor. Trust had disintegrated. The Reich devoured itself from within. On April 22, during a conference, Hitler finally admitted aloud what his generals had known for years: the war is lost. The words hung in the air, heavy, final. Those around him said nothing. There was no comfort left to give. Days later, as Soviet artillery struck the heart of Berlin, Hitler made his final decision. On April 30, he took his own life beside Eva Braun. Above ground, the Red Army raised its flag over the Reichstag. The Third Reich had fallen. For the generals, it was not a moment of relief, but of emptiness. They had fought for years knowing this day would come. Some were captured by the Allies, others by the Soviets. Many would face trials, imprisonment, or death. But none could escape the weight of what they had been part of. In the ruins of Europe, the survivors looked back in silence. They remembered the summer of 1941, when victory seemed certain, when the world lay at their feet. And they remembered how, long before the bombs fell on Berlin, they had already seen the truth, that the war was lost, not in battle, but in blindness. For those who lived, the war never truly ended. It remained in every order given too late, every soldier sacrificed for pride, every silence that allowed madness to rule. They had witnessed the collapse of a nation, and of themselves. As the smoke cleared from Berlin, one truth stood unchallenged: Germany had not been defeated by its enemies alone, but by the illusions of its own making.